All right, well, welcome everybody. I am going to call us to order here at 3:02 p.m. This is a special meeting of the Altadena Library District Board of Trustees. It's our capital projects discussion. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here on a Wednesday afternoon. We really appreciate your time. We will begin with a roll call of the board and then a quick little introduction of everybody else who's with us. So Trustee Andrews.
Here.
Trustee Capel.
Here.
Trustee Cervantes.
Here.
And we have received apologies from Trustee Wilkerson, who's not able to be with us today. Let's do a quick round of introductions of everybody who's with us. So as those of you who have been with us for our previous joint capital projects discussion meetings will recall this is sort of a joint meeting of the Facilities Committee and the CFD Committee. So I will hand it over to Terry to introduce all the folks who are with us from the CFD side.
From the CFD side, I see we have Kim Kinney, and my screen only shows so many. There we go. Kim is a sort of neighborhood, if you will, volunteer for the committee, citizen representative, and we're so glad to have her on board. I don't see, well, I do see Amy Leifert also is on the committee, and she is down at the bottom right there. Again, another citizen member, really appreciate that. And then the last citizen member is Jim Vitale, who I don't believe is here today. And then the other trustee representative is Rushmore Cervantes, so it makes 5 of us.
Okay, thanks very much. And Kim, Amy, so glad to have you with us. Thanks so much for being here and for all the hard work you guys have been putting in on the CFD side. We see your reports every month and whew, you guys have been getting after it. All right, for those of us from the Facilities Committee side, I'll hand it over to our current chair, Jason Capel, to introduce that side.
All right, so besides Katie and myself, we've got Jennifer Pearson with us from Racklin Partners. And then obviously our fearless facilities manager, Jonathan Arevalo. And Jennifer, were we expecting anybody else from Racklin today?
We've got Richard as well.
Richard, how come I don't see? Oh, you know what?
Yellow review.
Oh, there we go. Yes, Richard has joined us as well. Thank you for catching that. I'm trying to like scroll across the top there. And so, yes. So yes, thank you guys, everybody, for joining today on a Wednesday afternoon.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And then, of course, we have our district director, Nikki Winslow, and we have a number of the experts who are supporting us as well. So, Nikki, if you'd like to briefly introduce everybody we've got here. Thank you.
Happy to. Good afternoon, everyone. And I did go through and rename everyone so that your firm is also listed with your name. So we have our municipal advisor with from Urban Futures, Doug Anderson, here with us. We also have Bond and Disclosure Council, 2 of them actually. We got the sad news that Nora is leaving BB&K, so she's brought her predecessor along. And is it Mernal? Did I say that right? Okay. Yeah. So we have Nora O'Brien and Mernal Shah from BB&K today to answer any questions related to bond and disclosure. They produced almost all of those papers in the packet, so you're welcome. Let's see, we have Nick Dayhoff from NBS, which is our special tax assessment firm and CFD administration firm, as well as Mike Kavanaugh, who works for our bond underwriting firm, Hilltop Securities. So this is the Power bond issuance team.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much. Okay, so next we're going to adopt the agenda. So basically the game plan for today is to go through a couple of informational items, and then our action item, should we choose to take action on that today, is to adopt some bond issuance documents in advance of our regular board meeting at the end of this month. So I will ask at this time for a motion to approve the agenda.
I move we approve the agenda.
Okay, do I hear a second? Second. All right. Thank you for that enthusiasm. Unfortunately, because it's a special meeting of the board, I have to ask for a trustee to second it, but I love it. So no, you're good.
Also-
You were procedurally right there. Thank you, Rushmar. I appreciate that. Motion's made and seconded. As always with Zoom, we do roll call votes and everything. So quick roll call vote of the trustees. Trustee Andrews,
Aye.
Trustee Capel,
Aye.
Trustee Cervantes,
Aye.
and an I vote for me. All right, we've got ourselves sorted on the agenda. I'm not aware of any public comment that's come in on either agendized or non-agendized items. Diego, anything to report there?
No, you're indeed correct. No, no public comment on our end.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So that, and as always, if public comment does come in, we will, we would love to entertain that if and when we hear from folks, but as of now, there's nothing. So that brings us out of the sort of formal piece of it into some of our informational discussion parts. So the first thing up we've got is item 4A, and you'll see a staff report in your package beginning on page 3. And so the first thing we're going to do is take a quick look at our capital projects budget. So this is sort of the facilities committee piece of the meeting. So this is a large part of what we've been working on, is putting together what you see in its summary form here of what it's going to take to fix up these library facilities properly. So I'm going to ask Jason, would you like to speak to this item briefly beyond what's in the staff report?
Yeah, I mean, I can just kind of add a little bit more detail to some of the information that's in the packet as to, kind of what brought us here today.
Okay.
We've, at least with the facilities committee, what we've been spending a lot of time on and is just looking at, trying to get a better grip on the actual cost of the work that needs to be done, but also having a clearer understanding of how the bond process works, right? And, I think having gotten some clarification on that, I think some of us, who are not professionals in this, haven't done it in the past, had initially thought, well, we can bond the full amount, and if we, do our jobs and come in under budget, we can just pay it off early. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem to work that way in the bond market. So now, the biggest priority obviously is to be good and to be very responsible with the taxpayers' money here in Altadena, and just really making sure we are crystal clear on all of these points. So what we've asked for is, what are some options? So that way, when the board is making the decision on exactly how much to bond, we know what the impact is on that, not only on the cost to the district, but obviously the cost to the taxpayers in Altadena. And because at the end of the day, we don't want to spend any more than we absolutely have to in order to bring our libraries up to where they need to be. So that's just a lot of the discussion that's been behind this. And that's why we're here today, is just to see some of the breakdown in those details, the breakdown in those numbers, so we can make the most educated decision possible as a board.
Great, thanks. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is hand it to Jennifer Pearson from Rathland Partners. So a lot of the work we've been doing in concert with our colleagues at Rathland has been around figuring out exactly what all this comes down to. What does it look like in terms of cost? So I think just for the sake of clarity, I'd love to have Jennifer walk us through the summary budget, and then I'd like to open up the floor at that point for questions and discussions. I do see a hand from you, Kim, but if we can have Jennifer go through, I think it may answer your question, and if not, then we'll hit it as soon as she's done. Okay, perfect.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Is everybody seeing that?
Yes.
All right, let me just try to make it a little bit bigger for you. So this is our budget summary report. And as you see, we are budgeting $22.5 million for our construction projects and related costs. So I'm just going to go through briefly the 10 different line items that make up that amount. The first one is accounting and legal fees. We're not actually budgeting anything for this. That's going to come out of another budget. So that's 0. Second item, reports, investigations, and studies. So this includes things such as the Tier 3 seismic evaluation that is nearing completion. Also things like geotechnical investigation, topographic surveys, hazardous material surveys, that sort of thing. So that's all in number 2. Number 3, plan check and permit fees. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Number 4, utility fees. So that covers things like connections to offsite utilities. For us, that's primarily going to be fire sprinkler water, so that we can upgrade the main library's fire sprinkler system. Number 5 is the architectural fees. So, and this has been updated to reflect the proposed fees by Anderson Brule Architects, who was recently selected. Number 6 is Capital Projects Manager. That's us, Racklin Partners. Number 7, inspection and material testing. So this is for required inspections and testing during construction. Number 8 is the big one. That's the contractor or contractors for the 2 library projects. So this is the hard construction costs. And this also includes a 10% district contingency for each library as well. Number 9, vendors and separate contractors. So this is just other contractors aside from the main construction contractors, things like moving services or container rentals for storage and furniture and equipment that won't be supplied by the actual contractor. And then last, escalation and contingencies. So this includes a budget for escalation of construction costs and other costs, soft costs, of 5% per year to the midpoint of construction, as well as project-wide contingencies of another 5%. And that brings us to just under $22.5 million.
Thank you so much for that. And just a quick word to add a little bit of context to what Jason and Jennifer have said. So, what is the process by which we've arrived at these numbers, right? How did we get here? And that has been the work that's gone on over the intervening months since we saw all of you last. So that's been programming work with staff. It's been previous studies of the interior and exterior. It's been integrating all the results that we had from ARG and the facility survey previously. It's been getting those seismic and hazardous material studies taken care of. And it's been doing work with the community focus group to say, granted, we don't have like a design and a floor plan, that's the job of the architect, but here are the sort of programmatic needs that we've identified, right? Here's the list of things that need to be done. Here's the list of things that it would be nice to be able to do. Here's how they fit together. Here's how they prioritize. And that's the set of data that has come together to comprise this budget. Would you say that's fairly accurate, Jennifer?
That's very accurate.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So I think that's probably good in terms of context. At this point, I'd love to open it up for questions, for discussion, for any queries that folks have. Obviously, there are many, many hundreds of pages more of stuff than just the summary budget you see here. But we thought, in the interest of keeping things more accessible, we would start with this and then go into it from questions. So Kim, I saw a hand from you a while back. Do you want to jump in, lead us off? And I think we can take down the screen share.
Okay.
Probably did. But did we lose Kim? I see her on the phone.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Sorry, I was having technical difficulties, so I am so sorry, but I'm not sure I caught all of what you said. So I guess I just wanted to understand, if I had to explain to someone kind of, back when we went out for the bond, there were
Yes.
3 options, I think. And if I had to explain to someone kind of where we fell on kind of it was like the minimum, minimal, and the bells and whistles, where would I tell them they could find that kind of information to understand what this 22.5 represents in terms of those three options that they may have looked at a long time ago?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think one of the, I will say that like what we've learned since our initial estimating and the initial surveys that we did is that a lot of the sort of small, medium, and large, if you will, or, you know, bare minimum to bells and whistles things, that actually didn't map exactly onto the conditions of construction that needed to happen. So for example, like one of the things that was in the bells and whistle category was a full solar program, which we've removed completely. However, one of the things that wasn't in there was a much more serious like seismic retrofit, basically, which now is in there. Those two had almost the same numerical value, but obviously like the seismic piece is way more important. So I think what, you know, the first step that we went through was to take those lists of, you know, kind of small, medium, and large and look at them and say, okay, based on what we're getting back from some of these studies and some of the expert advice that we're getting, how realistic are those? Because those were a very preliminary set of numbers that were designed to guide our guess on, you know, what the bond amount should be. So I think a fair assessment, and you know, Jason, Nikki, and everybody from Rackland, please chime in and tell me if you think this is reasonable. But I think a fair assessment would be that this 22.5 encompasses absolutely everything that must be done, right? So things that for safety reasons, for ADA compliance, for, you know, deferred maintenance and all that, everything on the must list. Everything that's been identified by the community as essential. And that's things like technology infrastructure, more public space, more publicly accessible space, more outdoor, more usable outdoor space at both facilities, as well as things that I would say fall into kind of the future proofing category. And that's a complete redesign of an interior space plan, and a lot of our sort of, how would you say this? I guess the ways in which we're configuring the footprint of the building. So not all of those correspond in a one-to-one way, unfortunately, with the initial lists that we had from ARG. Those were a useful starting point, but that, you know, we've moved pretty far past that. So I don't know if that, how do you feel about that, Jennifer, Jason, Nikki, Richard? Do you guys feel like that's kind of accurate? Hopefully.
Yeah, and go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
I'd like to also add on the solar component. The reason that was removed was not necessarily lack of funding. It was looked on early on, and based on the utility bills of the library, we did not believe that it was a good use of public funds to spend that kind of money that would never be recovered. Just a fraction of it would be recovered over the life of this bond, and so that's why that was removed.
Katie, this is Kim. I think that was a great explanation. Is that something, are the components kind of listed, and is there something like on the website per se where we can point people?
We certainly have like a much more detailed budget that breaks all of this out. And you can also see, and I'm sure this is on the website, there's a sort of programmatic representation of what all is involved at both libraries. And now again, I will say, this is not a floor plan, right? Like, so this is not a representation of how things will lay out. This is things that have been identified by staff and by patrons as, these are things we really want in our libraries. These are things we think are really important and needed. So, you know, different ways of using the literacy space at Bob Lucas, for example, different, you know, ways of removing parking lot space and turning it into usable outdoor reading court space. So all of that definitely is on the website. And I'm sure that Diego or Nikki will remind me of the URL because I forget what it is. Is it
building projects.
/building projects. Thank you. Yes. So all of that is there. Like I said, it is a programmatic representation of what those components are. So I would caution folks, that's not, you know, a design, but it is like, these are the moving parts, right?
Right, and I might add to that point, Katie, because I know that this has been going on for years before Racklin joined, but to the point of the components, if we're looking for actually spaces, community space, and like you said, or the maker space and the spaces that Katie, as you say, we've identified, there is not a plan today because we just brought the architect on board. However, those have been, as what Katie's kind of alluding to, is those have all been budgeted, and so we have budgets, but we can't direct anyone to a specific plan because it hasn't been designed. But we have just launched that process.
That's right.
And I think it's also important to note that there will be additional open to the public community meetings that the architectural firm will be a part of. So, dates to be determined, but those will be happening before we have like 100% final plans as well.
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. Kim, does that get to your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I see a hand from Amy. Amy, please go ahead.
I'm just curious about whether the historic nature of the main library building, is that having an impact on the budget analysis of what's required? I'm just curious about that connection. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And I would say not only is it having an impact on the budget, it had a huge impact on our selection of architect, right? Like, so the decisions that we have made at every stage have prioritized maintaining the historic character of that building and also making sure that the folks that we're bringing in to work on it are people who similarly prioritize that. So yeah, that's been a big concern. And also, things like, how do you solve some of the seismic challenges that exist without changing the nature of that very particular floating block construction? Like, it's not as easy as just putting some big screws and things to, handle things in very unique ways. So that's what we've asked some of our consultant teams to do as well in their analyses. So yes, absolutely. Other questions or things people want to kind of dive into more on the budget or any of the ways in which we got to the budget? Terry, please go ahead.
One thing I want to make sure of, getting back to costs and stuff, I know that you've had a lot of experience thinking about budgets and so on. In your experience, does that contingency, that overrun contingency that you have in the major categories, allow you on all of your projects or most of them to come in right at the number? Having been through a construction process myself once or twice, I know that cost overruns can appear out of nowhere and really skew things. Are you pretty comfortable with the final number on this, having built in those contingencies? And I'll just throw that out in general to whoever at Lakeland wants to handle that question.
Yes,
Katie, do you want me to,
Yeah,
I'll
please.
respond to that because at this point I've been putting together the budget. So yes, at this point, in the absence of a crystal ball, I am comfortable. We've been doing this long enough to try and look at outside influences that could affect the pricing that's outside beyond the design, right? So we look at what's going on in the construction industry. And so we've taken all of that into consideration. That's what Jennifer's referred to as the escalation point. So far, it's very early on, but we've got some confirming numbers from the seismic evaluation report, and we're on budget. So at this point, we're very comfortable that we're going to be able to do everything that we have set out to do for the building, and it's fluid. It will be updated as we go. But at this point, back to kind of Kim's question, everything is still that we initially thought or had hoped would be in the project is still in the project.
Okay, great, thank you.
So just, in terms of sort of a procedural note, so the goal today is to really, hopefully by the end of our discussion, arrive at a number that we all feel pretty comfortable at in terms of like what's the amount of money we're going to bond out for these projects, right? So obviously, the whole process of issuing the bonds, which we're going to get to next, is one piece of that. But a big driver is obviously what is our project budget that we need for these two libraries. And so I think that, you know, it's pretty fair to say that after much process, the number we've arrived at is 22.5, inclusive of escalators, of contingencies, of, you know, project-wide things. And as Richard says, you know, like, we don't have a crystal ball, who knows, like, things can always happen, but controlling for all the things that one can control for at this point, that seems like a pretty reasonable estimate. I don't want to forestall any discussion, so we can move on to the next piece. But if anybody has any other questions about the capital projects budget, this would be a good time to dive into those. Anything else that folks want to talk about on this? Okay. All right. Well, let's then shift gears a little bit and move to our next item, which is a discussion of the CFD bond issuance options. So you'll see all of this beginning on page 5 of your package. So you'll see a staff report here. And what we've got are a couple of options. Nikki, do you want to talk, or Terry, either of you, a little bit about what we've got here and what we're looking at today, and then perhaps ask some of our consultants to chime in as well on what we're looking at and why.
Right. So I don't even hardly know how far to go back, but you know, getting to this point, we all knew that the max that we look at bonding out based on estimates that were done during the architectural and design review almost 2 years ago now was the $24 million. So a lot of the numbers that were run were based on that number. So through the discussions we had, and I think I pointed out in the staff report, we've been meeting with Racklin Partners every Monday since May 3rd. I think we just hit our 28th meeting of the year or something. And about a month ago, Richard raised the question of, should we do 2 issuances? Like, is it more fiscally responsible to like not bond out as much, like, because we're not going to spend it all right away. So are we better off doing one big issuance or separating them into 2? And what would the cost implications of that be? So I reached out to our municipal advisor, Doug Anderson, to see like what we could do to generate some numbers around doing 1 or 2 issuances. And what we discovered, happily so, is that based on information provided to us from our municipal advisor, as well as our bond underwriter, Mike Kavanaugh, that we haven't gone through the credit rating process with Standard & Poor's, but they anticipate that we're going to get a very high credit rating because we're an already established community facilities district. From what I understand, a lot of times these districts are formed and they're not developed yet. So it's like kind of a guess as to how as it's being built, how much money is going to come in. Whereas like with us, so it's a higher risk for the people buying the bonds. Our bonds are very secure because our district's already formed. So we'll get a high credit rating. And from what Mike told us, I think it was last week, all my days are a blur, but this is like the best time in 10 years or something to be selling municipal bonds. And they anticipate that we're going to be able to sell premium bonds, meaning, and this is probably not the right way to describe this, Mike, but the people that buy the bonds are almost paying us to buy them. So we're getting more in proceeds than we're bonding out, which is the par amount. So when we had Mike run the numbers for us, if we bond out the full 24 million at this point, based on estimates, obviously, and guess, we'd get over 27 million in proceeds. So we met last week with the bond issuance team to talk through these scenarios, knowing that our budget, even with contingencies and escalations, right now is estimated at 22.5. So then we asked Mike to go back and run the numbers so that what would we have to bond out to get the proceeds either at the 22.5 or to have 24 million, to have a little bit of a cushion, to Terry's point, in case something happens and we end up needing more money. So starting on page 7 of the package, that's the 22.5 million projection. So if we were to bond out, it looks like 19.8. That would get us close to that 22.5 million. And then I believe it was 21.125 that we would have to bond out to get proceeds of around 24. So I don't know what else to add to that. Terry, did you have anything you wanted to add? Or Katie, anything I'm missing? But in other words, this is excellent news that we're not going to have to go out and bond even close to the 24. And if for some crazy reason we need more money down the road, we do have the ability to bond out the additional, whatever, be it 3 or 4 million. We don't anticipate that happening. But it's almost like the stars aligned for us to issue these bonds right now. And I believe Mike told us last week that people anticipated the interest rates going up. So they did in October. So if we had gone through the bond issuance process, I think our interest rates would have been not as good. I don't know how bad they would have been, but it's almost like it worked out that we ended up pushing this off a few months. So we have the whole team of experts here. So
the only thing I would add or ask, I guess, Nikki, would be, and this is just me going, being very fundamental, but I think the money page, no pun intended, is number 7 for the lower amount we would fund. And if you look at the bond proceeds on that, the par amount is $19,810,000. So if you do the math, and we're issuing $5,000 bonds, tell me if I got this wrong or right, everybody, that would be $3,962 $5,000 bonds that would be sold to provide the par amount for that. And then the premium, that additional amount, is because it's a favorable time to be selling bonds, basically, right? Am I thinking about this in the right way, or is it more complex than that?
Mike, I see you. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Trustee Andrews. How the bond market works, if you look at page 8, this is a great example. Page 8. So a premium bond is when the coupon, or in this case, the rate, is higher than the yield. So right now, buyers want higher coupons and they'll pay for it. So in this instance, we're looking at selling maturities, as you can see on page 8, anywhere from 355,000 in 2023 all the way out longer, right? So every year, more or less, has a different coupon and yield, and that produces a different price. So on average, if you go down to page 9, you'll see this production line item, and that's telling you on average, you're selling a $5,000 or you're selling a 10,000, where you sell $5,000 increments, but round numbers, you're selling $10,000 of increment for $11,000, and they're paying you $11,600 because you're paying a higher coupon, and the difference between the coupon and the yield is the price. And it's really a marketing ploy that buyers want this. Sometimes they want discount bonds, which means the rate is lower than the yield. But in today's market, and it has been for the better part of a year, this is the best, most efficient form of borrowing for issuers.
Okay, thank you for that. This bond 101 for me, but I want to make sure I got it straightened out.
I understand. It's an interesting concept, and I live it every day. So hopefully I explained that right.
This answers all of my questions too. I thought like that par amount was what it's going to cost us to get the amount we need. So, hey, happy days.
Yeah, they're paying the premium to have the higher coupon is the simple answer.
I see a hand from Kim. Kim, go ahead.
So bonds are not my specialty in any way, even though a long time ago I worked for a brokerage firm. But the question I was asked was, isn't this a high par amount and there are munis at lower amounts? I think what I heard you say was by doing the higher rates, the 4%, we are getting the premium, so we're getting more money in our pocket. I guess my question would be then, did I understand that right? But also at that 4% rate, then are we in the long run paying more in interest?
Those are good questions as well. The market in the last year or so was heavily on 5%. So the market shifts, as I said before. I mean, we've sold 3%, 4%. Right now, the overall demand for coupons is 4%. And yes, there is, if you go back to that slide 8, and it looks like, Kim, you're not looking at it, but, and this is going to go a step further, and it usually confuses most issuers who aren't in the market all the time. But if we're looking at slide 8, and we look at, we'll just take one maturity. We'll take the 2041 maturity, where you're selling a 4% coupon to yield a 184, and that's a dollar price of 117. And so those bonds are callable at 9/129 at 103. So by law, we have to price those bonds to that call. So to answer your question is, if you don't call the bonds, then the yield isn't, then the yield is 2.815, right? So this is assuming you call the bonds in 10 years or 8 years, whatever the case may be. So I don't know how to answer your question, because it's yes, you pay more interest, but you have the right to call the bonds. What I do is I look for my issuer clients the best possible scenario to lower your rates today, because I don't know what's going to happen in 10 years. I don't know if you're going to be able to call these bonds in 10 years. So I look more for today and to keep your options open today. So that's why this 4% coupon is the overwhelming best solution in today's market. If there's a better one when we come time to price, which to me, a better one would be a lower coupon, because it lowers the yield to maturity and it's better off today. But a lower coupon, you're not likely to call it, right? But it shouldn't matter. It should matter some, but I don't put a lot of weight into that. And I probably just didn't answer your question, but does that make any sense?
No, I think you did. You said
Okay.
the people who are in this market understand all the pluses and minuses, and you're creating the best mix of those for us. And so thank you very much.
Yeah, and if when we come closer to pricing, you know, my guess is things are going to change dramatically different. And I work with Doug and Urban Futures as your municipal advisor. Say, hey, Doug, hey, let's look at maybe a 3% coupon or a 5% coupon. Here are the advantages. Here's the disadvantages. And we would look obviously to do the best deal for you given the time of the market at time of pricing. But as of today, I think this is it.
Okay, thank you so much. Rushmore, I see a hand from you. Please go ahead.
Oh, great. Just a quick question, and thank you for all this helpful information. On page 11, looking at the debt service, on an amount of $19,810,000, does this then reflect that Citizens of Altadena will repay basically $34,800,000 over the course of that period of time? What does that number reflect?
This is Mike Kavanaugh. I'll answer that. Yeah, so that's the amount you will repay to net $22.5 million in proceeds.
Okay. And then are these tax exempt bonds or taxable bonds?
California federal tax exempt bonds.
Okay, got it. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, are there other questions? I've got a question for Mike. So Mike, based on what you've said about the way that, you know, market shifts happen and pricing and all of that, if we were to say to you, okay, we've decided it makes sense, we want to go with the 19.8 par amount or 20.2 or, you know, whatever it is, how confident are you in being able to create a pricing structure that would still net out that same amount of project fund. Do you know what I mean? Like, are there fluctuations in the market such that it would be wise to build in some wiggle room there, or no?
Yeah, fluctuations happen all day long. So, you know, if
Right.
you see what the rates would be tomorrow, they could go up, they could go down, but there
Right.
always will be a market for this. And as Nikki mentioned earlier, you know, on a scale to non-rated to AAA, I'm guessing you're going to be in the AA category, which is, you know, top 5% of all issuers. You're going to be very well received. And I think there'll be a good, strong demand for your bonds, which is really the key to your.
Okay. All right. So what I hear you saying is that whatever we decide on as the par amount to issue, you feel confident that, you know, that will be very doable, and whatever strategies need to be employed to get there, it'll net out the project amounts you're
Yes,
forecasting.
for sure. And there is no difference in the marketing between a $19 million deal and a $25 million deal, just for rounding.
Right.
So, yeah, the size, if you want 22.6 million, it's no different. Obviously, it's just a little more in debt service.
Right.
But we can tailor it to, you know, 22.625. You know, we can get out any size you want, a project fund we can accommodate.
Right. Got it. Okay. Okay. I'd like to, before we move on from this item, I haven't had a question about it, but just for the sake of completion, I'd like to take a look at page 23 of your package. And these are some estimated special tax rates based on the two scenarios that that you guys have worked up for these. And I wonder, Nick, can I ask you to speak briefly to what we're looking at here in these two tables?
Sure. Thank you, Katie. So the table on the left is the scenario where the district would receive 24 million in proceeds. The table on the right is 22.5 million in proceeds. Each of the two tables have the same amount of special tax levy for services and admin. The only difference between the two tables is the amount of debt service for each scenario. So under the $24 million in proceeds scenario, once the services special tax kicks in 25-26, we would estimate that the special tax rate per square foot for SFR would be 10.43 cents. And under the $22.5 million scenario in 25-26, once that services special tax kicks in, it would be 10.09 cents, so slightly lower in the 22.5 million scenario. And these amounts that you're seeing here for services were authorized by the board at the time of formation. The board authorized $1.135 million for annual services in fiscal year 21-22 dollars. And we're just assuming annual increases to that number of 2% per year. Back when the CFD was formed, the board authorized $25,000 for admin in 21-22 dollars. And again, that number is just increased by 2% per year. So I did mention last time in our last meeting that if the district would like to keep the estimated special tax rate down, the library district does not have to levy that full amount for services that you're seeing in each year. So that can be reevaluated each year to keep that number down if that's what you desire.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick. That's right. So just a reminder for everybody. So, and a lot of you guys have heard this many times, but for anybody watching who maybe isn't up to it. So currently the district has parcel tax that funds services that was approved by Altadena taxpayers back in 2014. It's sometimes called Measure A. So that special tax, that parcel tax expires, it sunsets in fiscal year 24-25. And so part of the CFD formation, part of the measures you vote was replacing that parcel tax with a services component. And so that's what Nick is talking about. That's the thing that you see in that services column on both sides. So that is basically what replaces the Measure A parcel tax that is on your property tax bill currently. So that only kicks in when the existing parcel tax sunsets. And as Nick says, that's an amount that the board authorizes annually. right? So what Nick has helpfully put in here shows sort of the ceiling, right? The maximum possible that it would be legally permissible under the terms of the community facility district establishment for the board to levy. We are obligated to pay the debt service amount, like we have to do that. But the services piece, we can levy up to that amount. We need not if it's not needed, right? So that's sort of where there is some discretion. The debt service piece, we have to pay. The services component obviously would be responsive to whatever the needs of the district are and what the board determines to do at that point. So I hope that clarifies a little bit what we're looking at here. And you can see obviously the estimated square footage tax rate is with both of those two combined, and that's in that column. So any questions on this? Kim, I still see a hand up from you. Is that left over, or is that a new question?
I had two quick questions. One is approximately how much do we get from the current tax, just to compare it to that 1.2 that starts in 25-26?
This year I think it was between 850 and 900,000. But when we did, the reason we came up with the 1.1, I believe, was when we did budget forecasting. It'll be almost 2 years ago now. We found that by year 5, we were going to be having to dip into reserves. So we increased the amount that we would get just to be able to make up for some of those budget shortfalls in a couple of years from now.
Great, just wanted a comparison. And then my last one is a very picky little question, but at the bottom of this table, it says maximum SFR special tax rate in 5152. And it looks like there's 2 different values for the 2 different tables, but I guess I wasn't understanding why that might be.
Sure. So yeah, the first one, the 13.98 cents, is for the $24 million scenario, and then the 13.65 is for the $22.5 million scenario, and that's showing the maximum special tax rate for SFRs for each of these scenarios. So the maximum would kick in fiscal year 51-52. So that's the most that's the highest rate essentially that SFR would pay, and that wouldn't be until 30 years from now.
Let me ask. So I'm sorry. So I thought the maximum tax rate went up by 2% each year.
Yes, that's correct.
But the debt service is higher in the table on the left, right? So that's the differentiator, because it's a higher amount bonded out. So the debt service amount is higher, which is why the square footage tax rate would be higher.
Yeah, and it's also important to note that we're not actually levying it at the maximum special tax in any of these scenarios. So you can see the very last column on the right in each table is the percentage of the maximum special tax that's allowable. So when those services kick in 25-26, we're only levying 96.33% of what's allowable, what's actually legally allowable to be levied, and that is based on the 10 cents per square foot that was set for 21-22, and that's just increasing by 2% each year to get the maximum special tax. But what you're seeing in these tables are just actual, estimated special tax rates.
Right.
So
I thought that was showing us what the special tax rate maximum was in 51-52 in terms of the maximum allowable. What you're saying is this is the maximum charged any year, and it happens to be for both of the tables in 51-52, and that's the difference. I'm sorry, I misunderstood what it was showing us.
Yeah, perhaps my wording was a little bad there. Maybe it should have said just the highest estimated special tax or something there, just not to confuse the two.
That would work great.
Thank you. That was a great question. Any other questions on this piece of it before we move on? Again, this is sort of the time to dive into the nuts and bolts of how it works and why it works the way it does and all those fun pieces. Okay. All right, then let's move on to our final item. And this is a little bit more formal piece. So what we've got here is a set of bond issuance documents. And the big question that we've got today is basically like, what's the bottom line dollar amount, right? But I'd love to ask either Nora or Mernal to talk a little bit about what we've got here in terms of documents and why we have them and what decisions we're making at this point.
Sure, this is Nora. So we went over these documents with the CFD committee back in October. And these are essentially just further revisions to those documents, mostly some cleanup changes. And then, as you said, Katie, the biggest thing we have now in brackets in the resolution is the authorization amount, which right now is that $24 million in brackets. And so I can walk through briefly the resolution of issuance, and then that goes through, and through the resolution of issuance, you're approving the the form of the documents. And I believe these documents today is a recommendation, and then at the December 20th board meeting is when actual full board action will be taken on the dollar amount and then the final forms of the documents. So by adoption of the resolution of issuance, the board will authorize the issuance of the bonds and the conditions under which the bonds will be issued. And this would include a not to exceed principal amount, which is right now the dollar amount in brackets. The resolution makes certain determinations required under the Belarus Act. It contains information required to be disclosed pursuant to Government Code Section 5852.1, which are these good faith estimates that have been prepared by Urban Futures in connection with numbers done by Hilltop Securities. That's the true interest cost of the bonds, the finance charge of the bonds, the total proceeds expected to be received, and then the total payments expected to be made. So those will all get updated for the resolution that is in front of the board later this month, based on the determination that's made for the authorization for the principal amount. Doug will update those numbers based on that determination. The resolution of issuance approves the form of certain legal documents. It approves the bond purchase agreement. That document has been drafted by Albert Reyes at QTAC Rock as Underwriters Counsel. The BPA, bond purchase agreement, authorizes the sale of the bonds to Hilltop Securities and establishes the terms and conditions pursuant to which the CFD will sell the bonds to Hilltop, and Hilltop will purchase the bonds from the CFD. The resolution of issuance also approves the fiscal agent agreement. US Bank will serve as fiscal agent for the bonds. This agreement sets forth the term of the bonds, creates funds and accounts into which proceeds of the bonds are deposited, and provides for the payment of principal and interest on the bonds, sets up the project fund where the bond proceeds will go and will be requisitioned to be spent on project costs. This agreement also contains certain covenants of the CFD to the bondholders. And so as an update to the CFD committee back in October, a couple of items have been added. I think we still we're trying to decide, a foreclosure covenant if certain special taxpayers were delinquent. It's typical for the CFD to covenant with bondholders to pursue foreclosure proceedings. So we added in a $5,000 threshold for that in the current documents, and that was a new update. And then another update we made in the fiscal agent agreement was to put in brackets an excess proceeds redemption provision, if that is determined to be something that that is recommended. If there's extra money left over, you could call the bonds earlier. The resolution of issuance also approves the form of the preliminary official statement. This is the document that prospective purchasers of the bonds will rely on in making a decision whether or not to buy the bonds. So it describes the terms of the bonds, the security and sources of payment for the bonds, It contains information concerning the community facilities district and the library district and certain risk factors relating to the investment in the bonds. Under federal securities laws, the official statement must not contain any untrue statement of a material fact or omit to state a material fact necessary to make the statements made under the circumstances under which such statements were made not misleading. So it needs to state all material information and not omit any material information that would be important for a prospective purchaser when making a decision to purchase the bonds. The official statement was prepared by BVK and our role as disclosure counsel, but at the end of the day, this document is the district's document. So if during your review of these documents, now and then also between now and the board meeting and the final forms that are presented before the meeting in December, where you'll ultimately be approving these documents, if anything is in there that is wrong or incorrect, we obviously want to make sure that those changes are made before this is posted to potential investors. The resolution authorizes the preliminary official statement to be brought into the form of a final official statement after pricing. So you'll notice this document has a lot of blanks still, and those are all permitted omissions. So they're allowed to be blank when you're marketing to prospective investors. And then once the bonds actually price, the document gets finalized and brought into the form of a final official statement. The resolution of issuance also approves the form of a continuing disclosure agreement. That's Appendix E to the preliminary official statement. And that's an agreement between the CFD and NBS as your dissemination agent. And that these are obligations of the CFD to provide ongoing disclosure to the municipal market. So it includes an annual report with certain information being brought forward that's currently in the preliminary official statement that will be in the official statement, other information required to be reported pursuant to the Belarus Act, and then notification of the occurrence of 16 listed events that are required by Rule 15 C212 under the Securities Exchange Act of 1934. The resolution also authorizes the CFD to apply for and accept bond insurance and debt service reserve insurance. Right now, based on discussions with Hilltop, I think there's some decisions to be made whether or not there'll be a reserve fund or a reserve policy. So this gives flexibility to allow the district to possibly have a surety bond or a debt service reserve policy instead of a cash funded reserve. And then the resolution authorizes the preparation and delivery of the bonds pursuant to the fiscal agent agreement. And the form of bond isn't included as an exhibit to the fiscal agent agreement. So that's kind of a broad overview. I tried to highlight, the couple clean items that have changed since the CFD committee's initial review, which are really just filling in, the foreclosure covenant threshold, updating the risk factors section with some information, and then also adding in that excess proceeds redemption language in brackets for now.
Okay. We got that. There's definitely going to be a quiz, and that quiz is coming December 20th at our regular meeting. No, thank you. That's very helpful. And it reminds me that we neglected to discuss a little piece of this in our last bit. And I wonder if I could just ask maybe either Mike or Doug to speak to it. So as Nora mentioned, there is a provision in here now to call the bonds should we basically end up with leftover money, right? So how does that work, and what is the impact on the taxpayer?
Yeah, this is Doug. We did talk about that as an option, and Mike has had some preliminary discussions with his bond trading desk and believes that we could pay back a small amount of bonds with any leftover proceeds that are not able to be spent on qualified projects. So that was really the reason we did the two different scenarios here. One is a project fund of 22.5 million to match your current budget. The other is numbers based on a project fund of 24 million, which gives you $1.5 million cushion. And that's really the size issue that we were talking about, having a piece that could be paid back after 3 or 4 years with the $1.5 million that you may or may not use. So that's kind of the reason that we did the two different scenarios. I think when we started this discussion 5 or 6 months ago, we weren't anticipating that we could pay back bonds so quickly, but Mike informed us that the market has allowed that on certain times of transactions. So that was good news. We'll give you some flexibility. Doesn't mean you should issue enough to get 24 million. That's really up to you, but that is an option at this point.
Okay. And then just to make sure that we're using terms correctly, Nora, can you confirm that the aggregated principal amount is the same as the par amount? Are those two things the same, right? Like that's the amount issued.
Yes, the principal amount, aggregate par amount, that's the amount issue. So the authorization for the CFD is 24 million is the top. So the maximum authorization under the CFD formation and approval is 24 million.
Right, perfect. Okay, so what we're kind of doing today is we're almost functioning like a committee of the whole to make a recommendation to ourselves, to our future selves in 3 weeks as to what we want to vote on as the final amount. So one of the biggest goals for our discussion today is to get to a consensus around what we feel like makes sense as a principal amount, par amount, like basically what is the issue amount, understanding that the proceeds will be, based on everything we've heard today, slightly greater than that, right? Based on the way the market is performing. So what is the number we feel comfortable with moving forward on? And I see a hand from Rush. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So if we were to issue the full $24 million and we were to realize savings of some kind, which we're hoping that would be the case, the actual repayment amount would remain the same throughout the through the maturity of the debt repayment, but it would just be paid off maybe a year or two early. So in other words, if it, let's say for instance, if the each single family residence is going to pay $10 per year, just for simple math, even though we may pay it off early with proceeds, it's still going to be $10 every bill. It just, instead of paying through 2051, it could be maybe paid off in 2049. Is that the correct assumption?
No, it's actually better than that. If we determine after 3 or 4 years that we aren't going to spend, say, $1.5 million, we can pay those corresponding bonds of $1.5 million off at that point. So the full debt service would only be for 3 or 4 years. Then it would drop down to the amount, the net amount after you've paid off those bonds with the proceeds that you didn't use.
Well, that's even better. Thank you, Doug.
One thing to point out is BB&K won't let you issue bonds if you don't think you're going to use that money. So if you're $1 million, but your budget's only 25 and 22 and a half, I think BB&K may have an issue with that. So just keep that in mind.
No, that's exactly right. And I think, that's the reason why I think it's safe to say that from the facilities committee side, we would not under any circumstances recommend issuing the full 24 million as allowed by the CFD formation, right? Like, because that would net like 27 something in proceeds, and there's no way we would spend that. It would be a bad idea. So I think what we're looking at here is somewhere between the 19.8 that meets the budget exactly and the 21.125 that provides slightly more, so basically an additional contingency. I think that's basically the range we're looking at. Does that kind of correspond to everybody's understanding? Are we all on the same page on that? Okay, Kim, I see a hand from you. I'm pointing this way, like that means anything. Kim, did you have a question?
No, sorry, I just forgot to put my hand down last time.
Okay, no problem, no problem. Okay, so given all of that, I'd love to open up the floor to a little bit of discussion and just get a feel for where people are feeling comfortable, right? So in that range of somewhere between 19.8 and 21.125, what seems reasonable? What's your thinking? Where do you find yourself kind of currently? Because our goal is to make a recommendation to the board so that we can vote on this as a full board at our regular meeting at the end of this month. Go for it, Terry.
Katie, I just have a clarifying question because I had
Please.
a little audio trouble there a minute ago.
Mhm.
When you talk that there seems to be a limit of $24 million, and that might be a placeholder number in the report that the synopsis of resolution 2021.xx. So the idea is that we would not authorize as a board anything that exceeded that amount in terms of collections. Am I right about that?
We can't by law, so that's the maximum amount that legally we're allowed to issue. And I think what I'm saying, and maybe I didn't say it clearly, which is totally possible, is that we don't believe we should issue that much anyway. The maximum amount we think probably makes sense to issue is 21.125, because that would net basically 24 million in project revenue, or it would net 24 million in revenue, and a project fund of whatever it is, 20.
Okay, so that 24,665 number is a false number. Then we shouldn't look at that for purposes of capping what we're asking for. Because when I look at the chart again on page number 15, it's got the par amount and the premium, and there's that 24,665 on there as a number.
No, that's not. Yeah, that's not a false number. So what it's saying is that the par amount, 21.125, that would be the principal aggregate. That would be the amount we bond out. 21.125 is how much we bond out. Yeah.
Perfect. I completely understand now. So that is well under 24 million. So
correct.
Okay,
Correct.
Good.
Yep. And that's what Nick was saying earlier, is that even, at the maximum rate that we were considering in either of those tables, we're still at only 96% of what the district is permitted by law to issue. So that's sort of the point, right? Is that like, if something wild happens and I don't know, the price of copper is 10x as a commodity price because we live in an insane timeline, there's still, remaining money that the district could bond should it need to, but we all feel like the contingencies that are built in are probably sufficient.
Okay, got it.
Can I ask a question?
Is that Jim? Hi,
yes,
Jim.
It is.
Yeah,
Hi.
Go for it, Jim.
Okay,
Please.
now I'm concerned about whether or not we are carrying adequate insurance in the event of unknowns popping up during the course of the project, whether those unknowns are caused by world events or whether they are caused by unforeseen fluctuations in cost of construction materials and whatnot that could potentially be budget busters. How are we covered on that?
That's a great question. Richard or Jennifer, do you guys want to speak to that?
I guess I will. So I wouldn't use the term insurance so much as contingencies. We do have contingencies in place for unforeseen conditions, as well as for cost escalations, as well as an additional just project-wide contingency for whatever might come up. So
what you're saying is we do not carry insurance. We are carrying money set aside on the off chance that we have a need for them. But if a force majeure should arise, which happened 10 or 15 years ago in the construction industry, or has happened recently with regards to lumber prices and things like that. And if the force majeure costs were to exceed what we've got available to us in contingency funds, would it not be better for us to have some kind of a insurance policy to protect against that?
Yeah, so Jennifer, do you want me to handle that?
Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Yeah. So I don't believe that insurance policies, or I have not heard of insurance policies that exist to kind of protect us against a project cost. However, what will happen is we will bid the project out, and if there is something that has happened that we did not predict or did not foresee that shoots the project budget way over our budget that we have, we would look into reducing some of the scope in the project before entering that contract, so that when we enter the contract for construction, it is fixed at that price and it will be within our budget. So that's kind of
And it becomes
another layer. Go ahead, I'm
becomes the
sorry.
responsibility of the contractor then to absorb any increased costs that go beyond what he estimated. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so it goes, yes and no. So yes, it goes, it's the contractor's responsibility. So if lumber prices double while he's bid his project, then yes, he has to absorb that. Now, if there is an error in the plans and the architect has made an error, or he missed something, or the structural engineer did not design something properly, and we have to go in and redesign it, and they have to change the size of a beam, then that is not the contractor's responsibility. Then that would come out of our contingencies that we have in the project. So we call those,
Why
that would
would
come
it
out of
do
our
that?
construction contingency.
Why would it do that and not come out of the E&O on the part of the architect or engineer for oversight or missing something on his part? If they've
Right.
walked the building and they have done
Yes.
something,
Yes. So yes, and there is that avenue, right? So architects
Right.
will carry errors and omissions insurance. And generally there is what we call an industry standard or tolerance to mistakes that an architect may make. I mean, everyone understands that there's no such thing as a perfect set of drawings. And so within reason, we understand that there might be about 5% of the construction cost might have little mistakes. Because if you realize an architect's working at a very small scale, and he's working in 2 dimensions, and the real world is much larger and in 3 dimensions. And so the industry acknowledges that mistakes are made. Now, and it's set at about 5%. If there is gross negligence on the architect's part, where there was something very obvious, a mistake should not have been made, then absolutely the district can pursue the architect's errors and omissions and have him pay for the cost to fix what it is that he made the error on.
yeah, there is a series of checks and balances that before we even get to that point,
Yes.
it will occur during review of the drawings at pre-design, design of 30%, 70% of construction. And I believe that the level of professionalism that I have observed on these committees so far is of such a high level that it's reasonable to assume that we will pick up a high percentage of any obvious omissions that those of us that know would be looking for. So I'm trusting that's going to happen.
Yes, and again, that is all at this point. We're all confident that that's the direction we're headed. But again, in
Right.
absence of that crystal ball, but yeah, yes, and the contingencies that we have built into the project, both project contingencies and construction contingencies, should protect us against that.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Jim.
Okay.
Other questions or other comments, or folks want to weigh in on what their thinking is? Don't everybody talk at once. Rush, go ahead.
Yeah, just to clarity one more time, just at the beginning of this meeting, we discussed the budget and the grand total was 22.5 million. So when we're talking about issuing bonds that will yield or net an amount up to 24 million, which is great. but then we do have a greater amount than what is budgeted right now, which also includes, 5% contingency. So reconciling that with the residents of Altina issuing an amount above and beyond. Obviously, we have the responsibility to ensure that we have a sufficient contingency amount in place. By issuing a greater amount, if it's like $24 million, we're sitting on $1.5 million extra. That's a question mark, and should we be doing that? Question mark.
Right. That's exactly the question, right? So if we were to issue the 21.125 amount, right, we would have a project fund that exceeds the current budget by 1.5 million. And so at that point, I would imagine there's sort of two scenarios, right? One is contingencies arise or things happen such that it ends up taking that much money. And so it gets absorbed into the project costs. Or scenario two, nope, we don't spend it. We spend 22.5 or 22.6 or 22.4, whatever it is. And at that point, we basically sell that amount back.
Right. And so, two things, one of which, we could arguably increase the contingency percentage to give us a greater buffer if necessary, or we stick with the 5% and realizes that if we do have cost overruns and we did have to go back out and issue up to the remaining balance of the 24 million that we were authorized, there's administrative costs associated with that as well. So
yeah, just a quick point of information. The 5% that Richard was talking about earlier, that's an industry-wide sort of assumption of like margin of error. The project-wide contingency is a 10%.
10%. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. And then if we had to go back out and do this again, so if let's say for instance we go for the bare minimum, the 19.8.
Yep.
And we need to come back, 2 years later, so gosh, cost overruns are such that it exceeded our contingency. We need to go out and sell the remaining authorized amount.
Yeah.
What do we, based on this today's cost, what would that additional effort cost the library district?
Doug, Nikki, do you want to speak? My guess is like probably another $300,000, but I don't know if that's totally accurate. Is that about right?
Yeah, we did, I think like 2 weeks ago when we first started this discussion, we ran a couple of different scenarios. What if we issued 18 million worth of bonds and then came back with a second issue? So we did look at that. There would be additional cost of issuance for a second bond issue. We even assumed that the interest rates would go up 0.5% over the next year or two. So we ran some of those numbers. They weren't really that different. I don't think the total debt service amount ended up being, radically different for each one of those steps. It's just the fact that you have to do two issues. There are some additional costs. So yes, there would be additional costs and a slight additional increase to the property owners.
And just to clarify Rushmore's question, Doug, the cost of issuance, if we had to go back out and do another, $4 million issue or whatever, what would that cost?
It's essentially the same as the larger issue. Most of us have a fixed cost amount that we propose to you when we send in our proposals. And so it really doesn't matter. The only difference is the underwriter's fee. So Mike's fees are actually based on the size of the issue, but whether he does 24 million or 18 plus 6 or whatever combination, his amount ends up being about the same too if you do two issues.
Okay, so fair to estimate somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 for another issue.
I think that was about it. Yeah.
Okay.
Doug, if I may throw this out, and this may answer Rush's question too. The 5% that you said is an industry standard. Did you also look at that relative to the type of project that we're doing? What is the industry standard for recently remodeled projects to libraries in Southern California during the last 5 or 10 years? Is it in fact 5% or is it more like 7 to 8%?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right about that. To be honest with you, the industry standard is 10%.
Thank you.
I find that clients do not have the stomach for 10%. we try and hone in around 5%, but you're absolutely correct. Not necessarily for a library building, but for a project type such as this. So that would be a modernization of an existing building with significant seismic work. You're absolutely correct. It would be on a higher end, above 5%. But again, we are carrying a 10% construction contingency in the project in acknowledgement of that.
So what you're suggesting then is the 10% versus going to a 7% on the on that percentage kind of balances out then, in your belief?
Well, we're carrying 10% as a construction contingency. I had thrown out the number of 5% because kind of as a minimum, what we were talking about is going out after the architect for errors and omissions. And I was just trying to explain that there's a level of tolerance that people should expect, and that's at 5%. That you should expect that you're going to have that much changes on a project. As it starts to go over that, we start to look at the architect and the mistakes that are being made and whether or not there's negligence or unforeseen changes that they could not have predicted.
No, I understand that there is no guarantee of 100% accurate drawings. I am concerned that there is something in the contract with the contractor that will limit him to no more than a 10% add-on on any change orders, along with a verification or confirmation of material and labor costs by which he arrived at the cost of the change orders as they arise.
Yeah, so that would depend on how the project delivery method is. So if we go out and do a low bid, then we are not privy to what his subcontract agreements are, right? If we do what, there's other delivery methods where we have open book and he's got his bids and we see his bids, and he can give us kind of a guaranteed maximum price. I'm not sure if, the library district, if they can enter that type of agreement. I'd have to look into it. Make sure that it goes with the contracting laws that you as a public entity need to abide by. I know we do that type of contract with other public entities, but it depends on the delivery method that we're using with the contractor on what we can hold him to and what we can't hold him to in his contract. To say that he can't charge more than 10%, generally he's not able to charge us anything above and beyond what his firm fixed price is, unless it was something outside. Unless it was something caused by the library district, and that would be errors and omissions in the architect's drawings. Now, while the library district didn't cause that, their agent or their consultant did. The reason I kind of phrase it that way is there's outside forces that the library district is not responsible for, the contractor is, and that's fluctuation in pricing. Or say his subcontractor went out of business, and he had to go to his next subcontractor and they were $100,000 more and he already entered the agreement with us. That again is not the library district's responsibility, and the contractor has to absorb that cost. When he puts his bid in, he will have his own contingencies that we will not see, right? We're just going to see the final number. And those contingencies within his bid should protect him from some changes such as those.
Well, I guess that comes back to whether it is a grand max, a not to exceed or otherwise, as far as the contract amount, number one. And even there is a grand max in there. Allowances are typically made for the fact of not 100% drawings, because if they were, then his price would be based on that 100% accuracy and he would absorb all of it. I think we all acknowledge that there are circumstances that may occur, particularly in an existing building, where unknowns are going to crop up. And when they do, those costs will have to be picked up. It's unfair, though, for us to assume that some contractors will go into a project like this with the assumption that, right off the bat, we can figure that we're going to net 15% over and above the grand max cost because there's always change orders. Well, I don't think that that's fair from our standpoint, and we need to have an understanding from the contractor at the front end. We acknowledge the change orders may occur, and we are more than willing to pay for the actual cost of doing those. But as far as the cost for overhead and profit or whatnot, I think it's fair to say that we can in fact control that and make that part of the contract document.
Oh, okay. So just quickly before you respond, Richard. So I appreciate this discussion. I think it's an important one. It does slightly exceed the scope of what we're here today to talk about. We're kind of moving into some of the discussion around contracting and agreements and, you know, price controls that will be part of the subsequent design process. I think that's a really important discussion to have, but I do want to make sure that we stay focused on our scope of discussion today, which is, you know, the par amount we're going to recommend to the board going forward. So Richard,
Okay,
if
to
you've
bring
got
it back to
yeah.
to bring it back to center, Katie, all I was trying to do was to point out to Rush's concern about whether 5% was in fact adequate or not. And I think Richard has explained that between the 5% and the 10% contingency, it's their belief that there will be enough monies available for unforeseens as they crop up. If not, then given Rush's concern, I think the question on the table is whether or not we increase the percentage from 5 to 6 or 7% in addition to the 10, or if everybody is happy with the 5%. That's all.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I
Sure.
see a hand from Amy. So Amy, I'll hand it to you next. Go ahead.
So I appreciate all of what James has been saying, because that's exactly why I asked the question early on about the historic nature of the main library building. And the possibility that obviously there's structural issues, you know, et cetera, but there's also the question of the that historical aesthetic. And it does strike me that perhaps raising that percentage, as James was suggesting, and thinking about the bond issuance, I feel like we have to be very careful, because I feel as if there may well be things that are unforeseen because of the particular nature of the Boyd Georgie building that we have to be very sensitive to. And I recognize we're, you know, selecting contractors and architects knowing that this is an important issue, but the reality of working with this type of building that has that kind of age, but also historical significance, strikes me that we may wish to protect ourselves a little bit more than we might were it a more pedestrian structure.
Great. Yes, thank you for that. And just very quickly before responding, yeah, Mike has to drop off. I think we're set. Mike, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it. Thanks so much for your help. Yeah. So, right. So I totally agree. And in the interest of like moving this process along, here's what I'd say. I think that's totally right. I think that, you know, there's also the just sort of unpredictability of the current moment we find ourselves in. Like the last couple of years have been real wonky. And so from my perspective, yeah, the 19.8 gets us exactly to the current projected budget. And that's awesome. I would feel a whole heck of a lot more comfortable coming in somewhere around 20.5, 21, 21.125. I think those make a lot more sense, especially given the fact that we have the ability to call those bonds if we don't need them, right? Like best case scenario, we don't need them, and that's great. It's not an increased burden on the taxpayer because we pay those back at the 3-year mark and we're not paying debt service on them. So, you know, I think having thought about it some more, my recommendation would be that we proceed with maybe the higher amount that was forecasted in these documents, so the 21.125, with the proviso that, you know, if we end up not using those funds, then we can sell them back and we'd be paying debt service only on what we ended up actually using. That's sort of where I'm landing. You know, we can take a formal vote on that, but I'd love to hear where people are thinking. How's that hit you?
Katie, I would agree. I think that makes abundant sense, considering that, you know, we did, as I was mentioning earlier, if we do have to go back out, it's going to cost us more money.
Yeah.
And the fact that we can just, you know, as Doug articulated, you know, this is a best case scenario. We can actually reduce the overall cost to the homeowners on the back end as we pay this thing. If we have to refund it. So I'd go with the higher amount, the 21.125?
Am I getting that correct? Hang on, sorry, I've got a bunch of numbers floating around here.
Mhm.
me look at
I
it.
think
Yeah, the
that's-
21.125. So the second scenario,
Mhm.
that'd be scenario 2, right? So it'd be the 21.125, which would net out 24.6, basically. Terry, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with the line of thinking here. I think it'd be better to have a little bit more guaranteed, than we know we have than not. One thing that we haven't really talked about is that the facilities committee is going to be launching into a public engagement as well. And what's going to come out of that? I mean, if we have a low amount or the baseline amount to get this done, there's no room for any really good ideas that might come from the public. And really, since we're trying to improve a public facility, it seems to me we should have a little extra money to work with in that regard.
Okay, thanks. Jason, did you?
No, I was going to say kind of the same. I mean, I was leaning towards the lower end, but just based on this discussion and hearing from everybody, I think that makes sense. And look, at the end of the day, even at that amount, because of everybody's due diligence, we're still coming in under what the voters had approved. So.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, it would still leave 2.875 million available to bond should it be necessary. I mean, obviously, as we've discussed, that comes with an additional administrative cost. 0.1%. Anyway, it would be a percentage of that. But yeah, I think that would, I think we've got some consensus there. So, any dissension on that? Does anybody object to that course of action? I think it's important that we have a pretty good consensus going to the full board meeting. So if anybody's got an objection to that, I think it would be helpful to hear at this time. Okay. All right. Well then, if that's the case, what I would ask for at this time, I think we might as well take a formal action. Let me ask for a motion to recommend that the board approve an authorization amount of 21.125 million at its regular meeting on December 20th.
So moved.
Okay, do I hear a second?
I will second.
All right, thank you. Any further discussion or debate on this? Okay, let's take a roll call vote. Trustee Andrews.
Aye.
Trustee Capel.
Aye.
Trustee Cervantes.
Aye.
And an aye vote from me. All right, well then that is what we're gonna do. So if I could ask our teams to go ahead and get the wheels in motion with that amount, I think that's a real smart move. And I think it puts us in a good spot of splitting the difference between, keeping costs as under control as we possibly can while acknowledging that there may be some unforeseen circumstances that we can't predict right now. So with that, I think we are pretty much at a close. There's no correspondence or future agenda items. I don't know that we need at this time to set up an additional meeting of this group. I think as events unfold, we'll determine, in consultation when it makes sense to get everybody together again. I don't know that we have one on the horizon right now. So I think at this point, it just remains for me to thank all of you so much for your input and your thoughtfulness and your help. This has been a really productive discussion, and I hope everybody feels as good as I do about where we are at this point in the process. And thank you to our excellent advisors and consultants and experts without whom we would be much more confused.
Thank you all. It's been great working with everyone, and I wish you the best of luck in the bond sale.
Yes, thank you so much, and
Thank
a big thank you to Nora. Yeah, we'll be sad to lose you, of course, but wish you all the best in your next endeavors, and we're excited to have Myrna on board. So thank you so much for everything, Nora.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Nora.
Thanks, Nora.
All right. Well, then, if there is nothing further, then at this point, I will ask for a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
Okay. Do I hear a second?
I'll second.
All right. Any objection? Hearing none, I will declare us adjourned at 4:36 p.m. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.